Okay, we start in Kuf Mem Dalet Amud Beis today, where it says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. About 6 lines from the bottom of the Amud. So we return over here to the halachas of Schita. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Seichit Adam Eshkol Shalanovim. A person could squeeze a cluster of grapes, L'Teicha Kedere, into a pot of food. So if you have food that's already there in the pot, and you squeeze the grapes directly into the food, that's not a problem. And the reason is, as we explained yesterday, the only issue when it comes, the issue that there is when it comes to schita is when you're taking a liquid and removing it from the substance of oichel, of food. But if you're taking the liquid out of this grapes, and the liquid itself doesn't have a status of liquid, it's really food as well, because it's not being taken out as a juice, it's being taken out as a food to eat it, so then it's like separating 2 pieces of food from each other. That's not the malach of schita. So here, if it's going directly into food, if you're taking out the juice for the purpose of eating in the food, then there's no problem. That's if it goes into data. But not if you're doing the schita into a plate. If you're doing it into a plate that has no food inside of it, so then there is an issue of schita. Now, the way Rashi explains this Gemara here is, you look into the Gemara itself, it would seem that when you do the schita into the plate, so then that's schita. Now the juice comes out into a plate where there's no food in it, so that's schita min atayra. But Rashi doesn't say so. Rashi says, people don't usually drink juice out of a plate. What the Gemara is saying into a plate is as follows. If you do the schita into a cup, which is what you usually drink out of, that's mamish schita min atayra. You're taking juice out of the food, which is the grape. The chiddush of the Gemara is, even if you do the schita into a plate, why are you doing it into a plate? It's for the purpose of mixing that wine together with food and an ingredients of whatever it is in the plate. So really that juice, that the wine that's now in the plate, is food, is for the purpose of mixing it with food. Minat teire, this is not schita either. Just like if you do it directly into a pot of food, it's not schita because it's not a juice. It's a food that you're using it in the ingredients of a food. The same thing in a plate, it's also for the ingredients of food. However, midrabanan, because right now the plate is still empty, and people don't see that this is being used together with food, so therefore they were geyser not to do this, so you shouldn't come to do it directly into a cup. So this l'teicha kaira is only aser midrabanan. That's what it's mashma from Rashi. This is the way the Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch, and there's a Tzemach Tzedek also explains that that's what the pshat in this Gemara over here is, that it's only aser midrabanan into a plate. So you see from this, kasavar mashke habala oichel. So the point here that he's saying is that when you have a liquid that comes out for the purpose, did I skip something? Okay, sorry. Okay, going back up a line. Amar Rav Chistes said, Midivrei Rabbeinu nilmad, from the words of Rabbeinu, of Shmuel, we could learn, Chaylev Adam Eiz l'teicha kedera. You can milk a goat directly into a pot where there's food already, so you're adding it into the ingredients of a food. You can't milk a goat. This is, of course, talking about Yom Tov, as Taisus over here explains, as I'll explain in a moment. But you can't milk a goat directly into a plate where it's empty, and then you just have the milk coming out, so you're separating the milk from the goat into the plate. That's not allowed. Alma kasavar, what we see over here is that he holds mashke habala oichel. Mashke, even though physically it's mashke, but if it comes out for the purpose of being a food, we don't consider it to be mashke. It doesn't have the status of mashke. It has the status of a food. It's part of the ingredients of a food, and therefore there is no malach of schita. Taisus explains when you're milking the goat, if it's talking about Shabbos, so then the goat itself is not fit for eating. You can't shecht it on Shabbos. So what's the goat itself? As far as eating is concerned, the goat is psailas. It's not food that can be eaten. The milk that comes out is food, is oichel, that you can eat it. So either way, there's going to be an issue of separating the milk from the cow, which is separating milk, edible, drinkable milk from the cow, or the goat in this case, which is psailas, and therefore it won't be allowed. You're separating 2 different things from each other. So therefore he says this Gemara that's talking about milking the goat is talking about Yom Tov. Yom Tov, the goat itself is fit for eating. You could shecht it, you could eat it, and therefore there's no issue of milking the goat. Elamai, it has to be done into a pot of food and not into an empty plate.
So we can't milk the goat on Shabbos.
Correct. Just to add another point that the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch based on this Gemara regarding squeezing lemons, right? Squeezing lemons on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Are you allowed to squeeze the lemons on Shabbos and Yom Tov? So the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch, if you're squeezing the lemon into a salad, then it's not a problem. The juice of the lemon juice, goes directly into a food. It's part of the ingredients of the salad. It's not considered to be a mashke. On the other hand, if you're squeezing the lemon into a cup of water, so then it's becoming a mashke. That's how you usually drink lemon. You drink it in the lemon juice, in water. So that's not allowed. That's mamish schitim and atayre. But the interesting thing is, the Alter Rebbe says, Shulchan Aruch, if you're squeezing lemon into a bowl, into an empty bowl, is that an issue? So l'chayre, based on our Gemara, it should be an issue midrabanan, just like it said here regarding squeezing the grapes into an empty bowl. There's an issue midrabanan that there's nothing else inside the plate, so it should be an issue with the lemon as well. What the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch, that it's not the same thing. Lemons and grapes are not the same. Grapes is usually made for squeezing. You squeeze grapes always separately into a plate. Therefore, we compare that and we say Rabbanu wa geyser, just like you're not allowed to squeeze grapes into a cup, you're not allowed to squeeze grapes into a plate as well. Lemon, a person that squeezes lemon into a plate, it's never used separately. No one ever drinks lemon juice separately. It's too sharp to drink separately. So if you're squeezing lemon into a bowl, it's very clear that this is going to be used for ingredients for a salad. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe says, the gzeira that the Gemara says of here, according to Rashi, it's only a gzeira, doesn't apply to lemon. So therefore, the issue of squeezing lemon on Shabbos is only if you're squeezing the lemon into water, because that's the normal way how you're able to drink lemon together with water. Sagt the Gemara weiter, but the Gemara asks on the premise of this whole thing, and the next chelik of the Gemara, it will bring up this concept of the status of this mashke. Is it actually mashke, or is it oichel b'nigeya to mashke that's going to make something susceptible to tumah? Masav Rabbi Bacham. Zav shachela v'sa'ez, a zav which is milking a goat. So hachalav tameh, the milk is going to be tameh because he's directing the stream of this milk that comes out. So he's putting his pressure and directing it. So we know a zav that puts his pressure on something and that he's directing, in this case, the stream of the milk, it becomes tameh. Fragt the Gemara, why does it become tameh? V'i amrit mashke habala oichlin oichelhu. If you're going to say that whenever you have mashke that comes out, but it's being used in the ingredients of food, and therefore it has the status of food, so b'may is kasher. How should this be tameh if it doesn't have the status of a mashke? In order for something to be fit, susceptible to tumah, it has to have the status of a mashke. So Rashi explains, you look over here in this braisa, when it talks about the zav that's milking the goat, it doesn't make a distinction whether he milked the goat into a plate that was empty, whether he milked the goat directly into a pot of food. So therefore, the Gemara's question is, it includes even when he milked the goat into a pot of food, so in such a case, this milk doesn't have the status of a mashke b'chlal. So therefore, it never made it susceptible to tumah. And for the Gemara, Kedam Rabbi Yochanan. No, there's something that Rabbi Yochanan said regarding milking a goat, and therefore there is mashke here. What is that? Betipo hameluchlechas al pi hadad. There is the little bit of milk that's there on the nipple of the dad of the animal that the person smears over there in order to help it to milk the goat. So there is that little bit of liquid that he's interested that there should be there before it enters into the plate or before it enters into the pot of food, and that is liquid for itself. Hachanami, so over here as well, we apply the same concept that Rabbi Yochanan said. There is that little bit of liquid before the milk, actually the stream of milk comes out into the food. There's that little bit of liquid that's there on the dad itself, on the nipple itself, and that is the mashke that makes it susceptible to tumah. Masav Ravin, the Gemara asks from another case, Tmei Meis, a person that's Tamei Meis, Shesachat Zeisim V'Anovim, that squeezed olives or grapes. And now, these olives and grapes were kebeitze mechuvenes. The size of the olive and grapes was an exact beitze, which is the minimum size to be mekabel tumah. We learned this once before. What's the smallest size for something to be mekabel tumah? A kebeitze. Okay? So now he squeezed these grapes, tahir. It's going to be tahir. The case that we're talking about over here is the Tmei Meis is only touching the grape. He's only touching the olive. He's not touching the mashke, the oil or the wine that comes out. So he's touching the grape. Now this grape was totally dry. In order for it to become susceptible to tumah, it's when the wine comes out. The moment the wine comes out, it's not a kibetza anymore. It was exactly a kibetza. The second that the juice comes out, it's not a kibetza. So when did it become susceptible to tumah? When the wine came out. When the wine came out, it's not the size of a kibetza anymore. So therefore, it's tahir. Says the Gemara, what do we see from this? But if the wine that came out, if the grape itself was larger than a kibetza, so then tameh. So then the wine that he squeezed out would be tameh. If you're going to say that the wine that comes out, and it comes out directly as an ingredient for food, that's considered to be food. It's not considered to be a mashke, b'mayis kasher. So then how did this grape become susceptible to tumah? The wine that's coming out is going into an ingredient of food. At this point, the Gemara is assuming that this Braisa is talking whether in a case the wine came out into food or whether it didn't come into food. So in a case where it came into food, how did it ever become susceptible to tumah? And the Gemara, who meisav lav, who mefarek lav, the one that asked the question of Vina gives the answer. This Braisa is only talking in a case where he's squeezing out the grape directly into a bowl, an empty bowl, not into ingredients of food. So therefore it's a mashke, it's just a beverage that makes the grapes susceptible to tumah. Rabbi Yirmiyah, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, again, going back to this whole point that we're speaking about, kitanoi, this concept that when you have a mashke that's squeezed out for the purpose of food, that it has a status of food and not a status of a beverage, of a liquid, so this is a machlokes tanoim. Where do we see this? Hamachlik ba'anovim, a person that has bread, for example, that you put into the oven, or chalas, and he's smearing the surface of the bread with grapes. He's rubbing the grapes, to have the moisture of the grapes to go on top of these breads. Loi hochshar. That does not make this bread susceptible to tumah. Rabbi Yehuda says, hochshar. The fact that you're rubbing the moisture of the grapes on top of the chalas does make it susceptible to tumah. Right, this is similar to what's done today when you take the eggs and you put it on top of, there's a coating on top of the bread. So this is what they would do with grapes. So there's a machlokes over here whether that mashke that you rub on top of the bread, whether that makes it susceptible to tumah or not. My love, don't you think? This is the argument here. Mar sovar mashka bala oichelhu. Right, so one opinion over here is Rabbi Yehuda says that this mashke that you're rubbing on top of the bread, it's a mashke that's for the purpose of the food, it has a din of eichel. Okay, so this is the opinion of the Tanakama. Omar Sovar, and again, let me read the Gemara again. Did I read it right before again? Mar Sovar mashka bala oichelhu. Rabbi Yehuda holds that this mashke that's coming out and is being smeared onto the bread, because it's oichel, so therefore it's not mekabel tumah. Omar sovar lav oichelhu. And the Tanakama holds that it's not oichel, and therefore it is mekabel tumah. So we see here this machlokes is going to get to mashke that becomes part of the ingredients of the bread, whether this mashke is susceptible to tumah or not. Rav Papa says, Rav Papa, no, that's not the basis of their machlokes. The kul alma, everybody would hold mashka bala oichel, the mashke that comes out and is being smeared onto the bread, lav oichel. Really, it's not oichel, it is a mashke. And v'hacha, here there's a different argument. B'mashke habala ibud kamiflagi. We're talking about the mashke that really gets lost, that really evaporates. That's what the argument is about. What happens when you smear this bread with this wine? You rub the wine onto this bread. It goes into the oven, and then from the heat of the oven, it gets evaporated into the oven. So mar sovar mashkehu. Sorry. One opinion is that this has the halacha of mashke. Even though it gets evaporated, nevertheless, it does have a status of mashke. That's what Rabbi Yehuda holds. Mar Savar, the other opinion is, what happens to this mashke? It gets totally evaporated, so lav mashkehu. Because it gets evaporated, so therefore does not have the status of a mashke. Sagt the Gemara weiter, this concept, when you have a mashke that's not going to be used, that's getting lost, there's a machlokes that we find clearly regarding the subject, whether it has the status of a mashke. The Tanya we learned in a Braisa, a person that's banging around the olives. He wants to soften the olives, to ripen them, or to get some juice out of it, so he's banging around the olives. B'yadayim misavos, with hands that are tameh. He didn't wash his hands al netilas yadayim before. Hochsha. So he made them now susceptible to tumah. When he bangs them around, so some moisture comes out, it becomes susceptible to tumah. L'seifsum b'melach, but if he was just banging the grapes, not because he wants it to be moist, but he just wants to be able to salt them, right? If you try to put the olives that are completely dry into salt, the salt won't stick to the olives. So he just wants to have a little bit of moisture for the purpose to be able to eat the olives with some salt. So then, loy hochshar, he's not really interested in the moisture. He just wants to have the salt attach itself to the olives, so then it's not susceptible to tumah. How about if you have olives that are still on the tree, and he wants to know how ripe are the olives? Could he cut the olives or not? So he's banging the olives to see if there's some juice coming out, to see how ripe it is. Im lav, limsik im lav. So then, loy hochshar. So then, the liquid that oozes out of these olives when he bangs them on the tree, it doesn't become susceptible to tumah. Rabbi Yehuda says it does become susceptible. So now this last case that they're arguing about, my lav b'haka miflagi, isn't this the argument here? The mar savar mashka oimid leimod mashku. Rabbi Yehuda says even though when he's banging around these grapes to test them while they're on the tree, what happens to that moisture that comes out? It gets lost. He's not going to use it, but still there's mashka that came out that has the status of a mashka. Umar savar lav mashku, because this mashka is going to waste, so therefore it's not a mashka. So we see here this machlokes regarding a mashke that comes out but it goes to waste, whether it has the status of a mashke. Rav Yeshua comments regarding this pshat of Rav Papa. Yes, this second case, this second brisa that you just brought regarding the grapes on the tree, certainly the machlokes is about mashke that's going to waste, whether it has the status of mashke or not. But going back to the case of the person that's rubbing the grapes on the bread, that's not necessarily a machlokes about mashke that's getting evaporated. Over there, what the basis of the argument is, you have mashke, not the point is not that it's going to waste, not necessarily is it all getting evaporated in the oven. And also it's not really regular ingredients in food either. It's mashke that's being used just to shine the bread, like the egg that's put on the bread, just to shine it. The question is, when it's being used in this way to shine the surface and the top, the crust of the bread, what status does that mashke have? Does it have the status of a mashke because it has a separate shine, or do I say no, it becomes part of the ingredients of the bread itself because it's a shine of the bread? That's the basis of the machlokes.
Why do you need to dye in the sewer voice?
No, it's not for the akshara. It makes it tummy. Then it makes it tummy. You're right. It's not an ingredient. It's not an ingredient in the same way. It's just mitzachtzeh. It's just a shine. It's just an appearance. So it's a different thing. So the same halacha we mentioned before, we go back now to Shabbos. Squeezing things on Shabbos, he's squeezing a cluster of grapes on Shabbos into a pot. That's allowed because the liquid that comes out is a food. Not into a bowl or into a plate. Another thing that was added over here, and this is in the name of Rav, the dog litziroi. You're allowed to squeeze a fish for the brine that comes out, even into a plate where the brine is not in ingredients in food. Nevertheless, it's allowed because the tzir that comes out from the fish is considered to be a food. It's not considered to be a mashke, and therefore it's separating one food from another food, which is not schita. Yasef Rav Dimi Rav Dimi was sitting and said this halacha as well. Abai said to Rav Dimi, Aton mishmei Rav masnitin. You said this halacha, including this last point about squeezing the fish for the brine, you said it in the name of Rav, and therefore you don't have any questions. I learned this halacha that we just said in the name of Shmuel and v'kashila, and because of this, I have a contradiction and a question on what Shmuel said. And what was the question? Could it be that Shmuel said that if you squeeze fish for the brine, even into a plate, that it's no issue of schita, the brine is a food and it's separating two foods from each other? Is that true? But for ha'itmer, we learned the machlokes, kvashim shesachtan, when you have pickled vegetables, and you're squeezing the pickled vegetables for the juice to come out of it. Amar Rav, so Rav said, Le gufon, if you're squeezing this pickle, for example, because you don't want the pickle or whatever vegetable it is to be so moist, you want to have it a little bit drier. So you're squeezing it to get rid of it legufan. So then he says mutter. This is allowed because what's the person doing over here? He's not doing it for the purpose of the juice that he wants to come out. It's not a malacha of schita where he's interested in the juice. He's just doing it for the purpose of the improving the food itself. So therefore it's allowed. Lemeimeyen, however, if you're doing it for the purpose because you actually want the juice that's coming out, then pater aval aser. It's pater, but it's still going to be aser. Why is it pater? So Rashi says the reason it's pater is because the juice that comes out of pickled vegetables is not juice that's naturally there inside these pickled vegetables. It's the water or the vinegar or whatever other liquid there is that's added afterwards, that got absorbed in it. So when you squeeze something that got added afterwards, that got absorbed out, that's not the regular malacha of schita, where you separate something that was naturally there from the beginning. So therefore it's pater and atayra, but it's asam and rabbanim because it is similar to squeezing grapes. Shlakais, cooked foods, cooked vegetables, bein legufam, bein lemeimeyan, whether you're squeezing it for the benefit of the vegetable itself, you're trying to dry the vegetable itself, or because you want the juice or the soup, let's say, that comes out of this vegetable, mutter. Either way, it's allowed. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, echad kvashim ve'echad shlakais, whether you're speaking about pickled foods, whether you're speaking about cooked vegetables, legufan, mutter, if you're squeezing it for the food itself, then it's allowed. Lemeimeyan, however, if you want the soup or the whatever mashke comes out, pater aval aser, then it'll be pater, but it's still going to be aser. So what's the Gemara's question? So Rashi explains, you see over here, shlakais. You have cooked vegetables, and inside the cooked vegetables you have the mashal in a vegetable soup. You have the soup inside the vegetable, and you're squeezing it out for the soup. Says Rashi, this is very similar to the brine of a fish. The brine that comes out of a fish, before Shmuel says that's considered to be a food, it's not considered to be a juice, it's not a beverage. The same thing also with cooked vegetables. The soup that comes out of cooked vegetables, that's considered to be a juice, that's considered to be a beverage. That should be considered to be an oichel, soup that's coming out of the vegetables. And before Shmuel said that it's allowed, and here Shmuel says that it's aser. That's the question. Amalei, so he answers him, Ha'alekim. I can say in the name of the Eibishter, Einai ro v'loi zar. My eyes have seen and no one else. Mipumed Rav Yirmiyah Shmieli, I heard this in the name of Rav Yirmiyah. And Rav Yirmiyah and Rav Zera. Rav Yirmiyah heard it from Rav Zera. Rav Zera and Rav Chia bar Ashi. Rav Chia bar Ashi me Rav. It traces back to Rav. Rav is the one that says that if you squeeze the fish for the brine, that it's allowed. Shmuel never said this. And according to Shmuel's opinion, this is going to be a problem. It's awesome with the Rabbanan. Sagt the Gemara, now the Gemara brings the source of this very machlokes that we just said about the pickled vegetables and about cooked vegetables. Kvashim shesachtan amarav legufan, if it's for the purpose of the vegetable itself, mutter, it's allowed. Lemeimeyan, if it's for the juice that's coming out, pater avalasa, that's awesome with the rabbanon. Shlakais, if it's cooked vegetables, bein legufan, bein lemeimeyan, whether you're squeezing it for the vegetable itself, even if you're squeezing it for the juice that comes out, for the water that comes out, mutter. Either way, it's mutter, because one cooked vegetables, the liquid that comes out is not considered to be a juice or a liquid. That's part of the food, like in a soup. It's considered to be a food. Shmuel Amar Shmuel says, no, echad zeh legufan mutter. If you're squeezing it to dry the food itself, then it's allowed. But lemeimeyan, if you want the juice, the liquid to come out, pater aval aser. It's still going to be aser. Rabbi Yechanan Amar, Rabbi Yechanan has a third opinion on this matter, and he says, echad kvashim, whether you're talking about pickled vegetables, ve'echad shlakos, whether you're talking about cooked vegetables, legufan, if you're squeezing it for the purpose of the vegetable itself, you don't want it to be so watery, you want it to be drier, mutter, that's allowed. Lemeimeyan, however, if you're squeezing it in order to get out the liquid that's in it, chayiv chatas. He says you're chayiv chatas. Okay, so Rabbi Yechanan's opinion is not only when you squeeze a grape, an olive, which naturally has oil and wine inside of it, are you chayiv, even if you're squeezing something from the liquid that's inside of it, not naturally. It's inside because it was cooked in a soup, it's inside because it was pickled. Even that, you squeeze it out, you're chayiv chatas. Meisvei, the Gemara asks a question from a Braise. In a Braise it says, Seichten kvashim b'Shabbos, you're allowed to squeeze pickled vegetables on Shabbos, l'tzayrech HaShabbos, if you're doing it for the purpose of Shabbos itself. Avaleila matzah Shabbos. But you're not allowed to squeeze these pickled vegetables for the purpose of using it matzah Shabbos. You're not allowed to do something for the purpose of after Shabbos. Zeisim va'anavim lo yischait. Olives and grapes, you're not allowed to squeeze. V'im sachat chayiv chatas. And if you squeeze them, you're going to be chayiv chatas. So now this braisa doesn't say anything of any of these Tanoim, Amirayim that is. Not Rav, not Shmuel, not Rabbi Yochanan. It doesn't make any of the distinctions that they said. The only thing this braisa says you have to look at is, are you doing it for the purpose of Shabbos itself? Or are you doing it for the purpose of Matzah Shabbos? Nothing else matters. It doesn't say whether it's legufon, whether it's lemeimei, and all the distinctions that they all made doesn't say in this brayso. So therefore the Gemara says, Kashya l'Rav, Kashya l'Shmuel, and Kashya l'Rabbi Yochanan. This brayso presents a question on all opinions. So the Gemara, Rav metaretz l'taimei, and Shmuel metaretz l'taimei, and Rabbi Yochanan metaretz l'taimei. Each one will explain this brayso that there's something missing here in what it says in the brayso, and each one explains it according to his opinion. Rav metaretz l'taimei, Rav explains the brayso according to his opinion. This is what the brayso really means to say. Seichtim kvashim b'Shabbos, you can squeeze pickled vegetables on Shabbos, l'tzayrech HaShabbos, avaloyla matzah Shabbos, but not for matzah Shabbos. So this brayso is saying it's allowed. But what you have to add is, b'medvar mamurim l'gufon. That's only if you're squeezing it for the purpose of the vegetable itself. And if you're doing it for the purpose to get out the juice, then pater aval asr. Then it will be asr even if you're doing it for the purpose of Shabbos itself. So when it comes to cooked vegetables, bein legufam, bein lemeimein, mutter. Either way, it's going to be mutter. The juice that comes out, it's considered to be a oichel, not a mashkin. And then the brayso says, Zeisen va'anavim lo yizkleit v'im sachtan chayiv chatas. Grapes and olives, that is the regular halach of squeezing, and that's going to be totally asr. That's Rav's interpretation of the brayso. Shmuel metaretz l'taimei, Shmuel explains the brayso according to his opinion. Seichtim kvashim b'Shabbos l'tzayrech HaShabbos, and v'hu adin l'shlokes. The brayso gives one example of the vegetables that are pickled, but it also includes the cooked vegetables. Hamed var ma'amurim l'gufam, aval l'meimei, pater aval asr. As Shmuel already said before, zeisen va'anavim lo yischait v'im sachat chayiv chatas. So he explains the brayso like his opinion. Rabbi Yochanan metaretz l'taimei, and Rabbi Yochanan inserts into the brayso his opinion. Seichtim kvashim l'tzayrech HaShabbos, avaleila matzah Shabbos, which is echad kvashim ve'echad shlokes. It makes no difference if it's pickled vegetables or cooked vegetables. Hamed var ma'amurim l'gufan. But the brayso was only speaking if he's squeezing it for the purpose of the vegetable itself. Aval lemeimein, if he's doing it for the water, for the liquid that comes out, lo yischait v'im sachat nasa kemish sachat seisim va'anavim v'chayev chatas. It's like squeezing the wine and the oil out of the grapes and olives, and you're going to be chayev chatas. So each one interpreted the brayso according to their opinion. The brayso was mekatzer, and they explained the brayso to fit with their opinion. Amarav Chiyah Barashi Amarav. The final thing the Gemara says about this subject of schita. Again in the name of Rav. Dvar Teire. Min ha-Teire eine chayev el al drisas zeisim vanovim bulvad. You only chayev min ha-Teire when you're squeezing olives or grapes, which have naturally the wine and the oil inside of them, and it's a chatchilah designated for this. That's what they're made for. They're made for the wine and the oil. V'chein tana de bein menashe. Dvar Teire eine chayev el al drisas zeisim vanovim bulvad. Min ha-Teire you only chayev when you squeeze olives and grapes. But any other squeezing for any other fruits that are not usually designated for this, it's asim d'Rabbanan, but min ha-Teire it's allowed. Now, in this statement of Bein Menashe, he brings up another subject which is completely unrelated. Ve'ein eid mipi eid kosher, to use one witness that's saying testimony in the name of another eid when he didn't see it directly. It's just hearsay. So it's not kosher, elo le'edus isha bulvad. It's only for one case, which is edus isha. What's the case of edus isha? When you have to say testimony about a woman's husband that went away and we didn't hear what happened to him, he's missing in action, and you have someone that says testimony that he heard from someone else that saw that he died. So that's an edus that's accepted to allow her to get remarried, which is a sugi in the end of the Gemara in Yavamis. It explains over there that because she shouldn't be an aguna, Chachamim were lenient that she should be able to get remarried. And we rely on the fact that she's medayik, meisha daiko mitzvah. It's a sugi in Yavamis. We'll see when we get there, Mitzvah Shem. So this is a case where they relied on an eid mipi eid. So now the question was asked on this halacha. Eid mipi eid le'edus b'chayr. How about to use an eid mipi eid for the eidus of a b'chayr? Mahu. What's this eidus of a b'chayr? So Rashi explains what happens with a b'chayr. You have to give it to a kohen, and the kohen has to bring it for a carbon, unless it has a mum. If it has a mum, then it's not brought as a carbon. Then the kohen can eat it for himself. It's possible for the carbon. But here's the issue. If the kohen makes that mum, so then there's a knas of chazal that he shouldn't be able to eat it for himself. If it naturally gets a mum on its own, then you can eat it, the kohen can eat it for himself. So you have to have edus to testify that this animal got a mum by itself, and the kohen didn't make the mum. So the question is, for this edus of a b'chor to determine that it got a mum for itself, could you rely on an aid mipi aid? One aid saying something in the name of another aid. Rav Ami Yama Aser. Rav Ami Aser. Rav Ami says no, you can't rely on that edus. Rav Asi Shari. Rav Asi says you could rely. Rav Ami so Rav Ami said to Rav Asi, but for Hatana de Ben Menashia, we said over here in this braise, ein aid mipi aid kosher elal edus isha bulvat. It clearly says only for edus isha, not for anything else. The Gemara what you have to read this is le'edus sheha isha ksheira la bulvat. Eid mipi eid could be used in any case that a woman is accepted as an eidus. So since regarding the b'chayr, the mum for a b'chayr, a woman is accepted to testify about that, so eid mipi eid is accepted as well. Rav Yemer achsher eid mipi eid l'b'chayr. Rav Yemer said that this is acceptable for the eidus of a b'chayr. Kari alei, they refer to him as Maremer Yemer Shari Bukhra. Maremer, the one that says that it's allowed for a b'chayr. That's the nickname they gave him. The hilchase, the halacha is eid mipi eid kosher l'b'chayr. To use a second-hand testimony for a b'chayr is allowed. Going back to the last thing that it said in the Mishnah before, b'nigei to chalois devash. So it spoke about when you have a honeycomb that was chopped and it began flowing before Shabbos, you're allowed to eat from that honey on Shabbos. There's no gzeira that the person is going to come to chop it, according to Rabbi Eliezer at least. Rabbi Eliezer says that it's allowed. Chachamim are chayshish that he might come to chop it on Shabbos, but Rabbi Eliezer says once it was chopped before Shabbos and it's flowing out, you're allowed to eat from this honey on Shabbos. When Rav Hoshia came from Nerda, Asa v'aisi masnita b'yodei, he came and brought a braisa that said a similar halacha. Zeisim va'anavim sheriskan me'erev Shabbos, when you have olives and grapes that were already chopped before Shabbos, v'yotzu me'atzmon, and now the wine or the oil is coming out, asurin. You're not allowed to drink from it on Shabbos. This is the Chachamim, because there's a gzeira you might come and squeeze it yourself. Rabbi Eliezer, Rab Shimon matirin. Rabbi Eliezer and Rab Shimon allow. This is basically the same thing that it says in the Mishnah, but over here it's saying it regarding olives and grapes, and over here we're adding another name. It's not only Rabbi Eliezer that said it's allowed, it's also Rab Shimon that says it's allowed. Amar Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef says, Gavre Yisera Asal Ashminan. What's the whole chiddush of this brayse? The whole chiddush of this brayse is just that there's another Tana that holds like Rabbi Eliezer. That's the ganze chiddush. That besides Rabbi Eliezer, also Rab Shimon holds this. Amar Abaye answers no. There's a much bigger chiddush here. Tuva kamashmalon. There's a big chiddush that we're talking about olives and grapes, not about the honeycomb. If it was just a mishnah, havamin, I would say hasam hudemei kara ochle olibesayf ochle. In the mishnah, you have the honey that comes out of the honeycomb. The status of the honey doesn't change. The status of the honey inside and the status of the honey when it flows out is the same thing. It's the honey. It's food inside. It's food outside. It's not. It's the same thing. So over there, in that case, I would say that it's allowed. Aval hacha, when you have wine or oil that's coming out of chopped grapes or olives, the mekara ochle, when it was inside, it's part of the food, it's part of the peidi. Or the b'seif mashke, when it oozes out, when it comes out, now it becomes a liquid. I would say in such a case, this is more like schita, like the regular isur of schita, and over here the gzeira of chazal that you might do schita would apply more. And therefore, kamash malan, that's a chiddush that they don't apply the gzeira of schita in this case. Why takanat? What's the reason why you don't apply the case of schita, the issue of the gzeira of schita in this case? So some say the reason is because once it's chopped and it's oozing out on its own, it's not the derech of a person to take it and squeeze it. It's coming out on its own. So we're not chayshish that the person is going to take it and squeeze it if he drinks from it. The Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch says the reason is because once it's coming out on its own, so over here, minat Torah, there is no schita, because it's already coming out on its own. Something that's coming out on its own, and you just squeeze it to make it come out a little bit more, that's not schita, because it was already coming out on its own. So therefore, because the whole thing is, the whole schita, even if you would be schaychet as ism d'Rabbanan, to make a gzeira that he shouldn't be allowed to drink from this would be a gzeira l'gzeira. Therefore, it's allowed. That's the pshat Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch. No. That's okay, but that's if it's we're here. The Gemara doesn't talk about that. Alter Rebbe brings that in Shulchan Aruch as well, but the Gemara doesn't bring that up. Zok the Mishnah. Call. Here we go back to an in of bishul. Kol sheba b'chamin me'erev Shabbos. If you have food that was already cooked in hot water before Shabbos, she'erenaisa b'chamin b'Shabbos, you can cook it, you can return it back into the hot water on Shabbos. This is the Mishnah about ein bishul acha bishul, something that was cooked before Shabbos. If you can place it back again into the hot water, there's no bishul a second time on Shabbos. But if it was not cooked before Shabbos, it's raw. You could rinse it in hot water on Shabbos. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about rinsing it with hot water that comes from a kli sheni. If it comes from a kli rishon, then it's a problem. Kli sheni, it doesn't cook. Kli sheni enim avashel, as we learned a long time ago. So therefore, you're allowed to do it on Shabbos. Besides, when you have old salted fish or kol yasa spanin, a certain kind of fish, just rinsing it with hot water from a kli sheni cooks it adequately, and therefore you'd be chayiv for this. So that's one exception where kli sheni is mavashel, and this applies to any other case where you have hot water from a kli sheni that will totally be mavashel something. It would be aser. But otherwise, something that comes from a kli sheni is allowed. What's an example of something that you cook once and then you cook it again? What's something that has to be cooked again? The example is the hen of Rab Abba, the way he prepared it, that he would cook it and he would cook it again. Rav Safra said, I was once by Rab Abba in Eretz Yisrael, and I ate from this food, from this hen of Rab Abba. And if not for the fact that Rab Abba gave me to drink after I ate this food, wine that was old, good wine that was old, I would vomit from this food. It was so not tasty that it was mamish terrible. Rabbi Yechanan, on the other hand, he was from Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yechanan. Right? And he said, Rayik mi kutach de bavli. I would have to spit if I would eat kutach de bavli. It was so untasty. And Rav Yosef says, V'leida kanan mit tarnagel to the Rab Abba. And we're in Bavel, so we eat the food of Rab Abba that he cooks in Eretz Yisrael. So we spit when we eat this food, this tarnagel, this hand that Rab Abba prepares. Rav Gaza said, I was once in Eretz Yisrael, and I made the kutach habavli, this food from Bavel. All the sick people of Eretz Yisrael wanted to have this food. It was beneficial for them. So Adarabah, he's pointing out that this kutach habavli was very good, and all the people in Eretz Yisrael were interested in eating this. Huh?
It's not a stira, it's healthy.
It's healthy, it's not tasty, okay. Sagt the Gemara, Kol Shalei Ba B'Chamin V'Cholu, said in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to cook something which cooks very quickly, like this kol yasa spanin or these fish, even in hot water from a kli sheni. So hidiach mai, if you did rinse it in the water of a kli sheni, what's going to be the din? What's the iser? Is it asam min atayra or midrabanan? Amar Rav Yosef, hidiach chayev chatas. If you did rinse it in the hot water, then you're going to be chayev chatas because this mamish cooks it. Amar ma b'rei Ravina, afanan amitanina. We see it here in the Mishnah. Chutz mimeliach hayashim v'kol yasa spanin shahadachasan zuhi gemar malachtan. The Mishnah says this cooks it completely. This is the end of the malacha. Shma minas, you see clearly over here that this is the malacha that cooks it completely, and Yechayev Chatas. Yasef Rav Chia Barabe V'Rabasi Kamed Rabbi Yechanan. So the Gemara parenthetically brings up something, and this is shaykh actually to the din of the Churban Abayis, as we'll see. Today it's Erev Tisha B'Av, it's Hashgacha Pratis, we're learning this today. So they were sitting in front of Rabbi Yechanan. The Yasef Rabbi Yechanan Kamenamnen. And Rabbi Yechanan was dozing off. Amalei Rav Chia Barabe L'Ravasi. So Rav Chia was having a conversation. He says to Rabasi, Mipnei Ma Oifes Shebebavel Shemanim. Why are the birds in Bavel fat more than in Eretz Yisrael? Amalei. So first he says to him, Klach lemidba Aza. You can go to the desert of Aza, which is part of Eretz Yisrael. Ve'eracha shmanim mehen. I will show you birds that are even fatter of the ones that are in Bavel. But the question still remains. In the mainland of Eretz Yisrael, the birds of Bavel are fatter than the ones in Eretz Yisrael. So that was his question. Another question he asked was, why is it that the celebrations of Yom Tovim in Bavel are much more joyous than in Eretz Yisrael? Okay, so what did he answer him? Because in Bavel, they're poor. So on a regular day during the year, they don't have any wine to drink to celebrate. Comes a Yom Tov, they drink wine, a special occasion, so they celebrate Yom Tov with greater joy. Now, Eretz Yisrael, they had wine all the time, so they didn't celebrate Yom Tov with such a joy. Another question we asked him was, why are the Talmidei Chachamim in Bavel? Mitziyanim means they're dressed very beautifully. They go dressed with a special garment. So he answered him, Lefi she'enam b'nei Torah, because the people in Bavel are not b'nei Torah, and they're not going to give their Talmidei Chachamim the right honor that they deserve. So therefore the Talmidei Chachamim have to get dressed especially to get the honor that they deserve. Why are Goyim impure? The answer is because they eat the things that are not kosher, the shkatzim u'mashim, that makes them impure. So this is the conversation that Rab Chia bar Abba and Rab Asi are having in the presence of Rab Yechanan while Rab Yechanan is dozing off. Isabu Rab Yechanan. Rab Yechanan gets awakened from this interesting conversation, and Amalu, and he says to them, Dardiki, children, is this not what I told you? And say to your sister, you're my wisdom. What does this mean? If there's something that you know as clear as your sister, meaning as clear as you know that your sister is forbidden to you, you know this concept as clearly, then you should say it. But if there's something that you're asked about and you don't have a clear answer, don't give an answer. Why are you answering these questions that he asked you, and you're making up the answers, and you don't have a clear answer? Amrulei, so they told Rabbi Yechanan, V'leimelon mar, and so why don't you tell us any of these answers to these questions? What's the reason why the birds in Bavel are much fatter? So the answer is, these birds in Bavel, they're in Bavel all the time. They never were exiled. And they were there all the time, so they're fatter. Shanamar, as we see in another place, Shanan Mayav Menu'ura V'Shaketu Al Shmanov U'Bagayla Leholach. In a case by Mayav, when someone remains in its place, so he's tranquil and he's peaceful, and there he's Al Shmanov, he's together with his wine, with the sediments, and he has more fatness. So the same thing applies to the birds. The nature of the birds, if they remain in their place, so they're fatter. And v'halcha minol on the Golah. How do we know that the birds in Eretz Yisrael did go into Golus? We know the Yidden went into Golus. How do we know that the birds of Eretz Yisrael went into Golus? The Tanya, because we learned in Abrayis, Rabbi Yehuda says, Nun beis shana loy over ish bi Yehuda. In the time of the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash, for 52 years, nobody returned to Yehuda, to Eretz Yisrael. Shenamar ala harim, on the hills, Esa b'chi v'nei, I cry. And over there the pasuk says, Me oifa shamayim v'ad behemen nodudu. Holchu. That from the oif, the birds and the behema, they left. So there's a as the Gemara here says, behema begematria chamshin v'tartan haveh. Behema is the gematria of 52 years. For 52 years after the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash, nobody returned to Eretz Yisrael. But Rashi here says, after 52 years, in the times of Kodesh, that's when they returned to Eretz Yisrael. 18 years before the Beis HaMikdash was finished to be rebuilt, they came back to Eretz Yisrael to start rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. Either way, we see over here in this pasuk that the Oif HaShamayim also went into Golus. It's interesting. This is a pasuk about the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash, and I guess the Gemara is applying it also to the Churban of the second Beis HaMikdash. So that's the Tkufa that they're talking about over here. Chayre. Sagt the Gemara weiter. Amar Rab Yaakov, Amar Rab Yechanan. Kulan Chazru, all the birds, all the animals, all the fish, they all returned to Eretz Yisrael when the Yidden came back. Chutz mikol yasa aspanen. This is the only reason why the Gemara brought up this whole thing. This kol yasa aspanen, this fish that left Eretz Yisrael in the time of the Churban, it never returned. The Amar Rav, because Rav said, Hani Madri de Bavel, these slopes in Bavel, where you have water that flows, Mahadri Ma'il Ein Itam. It's water that flowed back to Eretz Yisrael when they went back to Eretz Yisrael. It went through the channels under in the seas. It came back to Eretz Yisrael, and they all went back to Ein Itam. Ein Itam is this spring that was there in Eretz Yisrael, as Rashi here brings. This is the spring that was used, the water for the mikveh and the Beis HaMikdash. So all the waters that from Bavel flowed back to Eretz Yisrael till Ein Itam, and the fish flowed back as well. But v'hai, this kol yasa aspanim, this fish, kivin de leishara shidre, it doesn't have a strong spine. Leimotzi salik, it can't swim upstream to go back to Eretz Yisrael. All the other fish, it goes in the water and it's able to swim upstream back to Eretz Yisrael. The next question that was asked was, why are the Yamim Tovim in Bavel much more joyous than in Eretz Yisrael? And for the Gemara, because in Bavel they were not included in this curse that the Eibishter gave. It says in the pasuk, I will seize all of the celebration, Chaga, Chodsha, Shabbat on the Yamim Tovim, on the Chodesh, on Shabbos, and all the Yamim Tovim. The pasuk says, Shana nafshi. The Eibusher says, I hate it. Hayu alayla tayrich, it became difficult for me. My hayu alayla tayrich. Why does the Eibusher refer to the Yomim Tovim of Yidden as something which is difficult? Amar Abelazar, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Eibusher says, Lo dayin li Yisrael shachayten lefanai. Not only do the Yidden sin, ela shematrichen oisi leida ezig zayda kasha avi alein. It comes to these Yomim Tovim that they force me to bring zaydis upon them. Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak explains, in Eretz Yisrael, when the Yidden would be trying to celebrate Yom Tov, there would be soldiers that would enter into the city and disturb the celebration. In Tverya, when they were trying to celebrate Yom Tov, so there came Agmain, Katmain, Balis Meira, officers, police, and government officials that would come and disturb their Yom Tov. The last question, sorry, not the last question. Another question that they asked was, why are the Talmidei Chachamim in Bavel dressed especially different? The answer is, because this is not their place, and therefore they have to dress up specially. The Amri Inshi, people say, B'masa, if you're in your city where people know you, Shemai, so then your name, your reputation, your name speaks for yourself. B'loi Masa, but if you're not in your city and people don't know you, then Teisvai, so then it's your clothing. If you dress with your garments, people will recognize who you are. And the Gemara brings another thing in connection to this, Haboim Yashresh Yaakov Yotzes Uparach Yisrael, that the Yidden came down and they blossomed and they grew. Tana Rav Yosef says, who does this refer to? Eil Talmidei Chachamim Shebebavel. This refers to the Talmidei Chachamim when they came down to Bavel, She'oisen Tzitzen Uprachen LeTeirah, that they blossom and learn a lot of Teirah. So in fact they were great Talmidei Chachamim. The only reason not to dress themselves up is because they were not in their place where their name and reputation is known.